All right, this is another image by Eva, and we're looking at shape images now. She's at ISO 4000, so again, a really high ISO. She's at 210 millimeters, so she's using a longer lens here. F8 at 1/80th of a second. So again, if she's walking around and she runs into this and she just happened to have her camera with her, then these are fine settings. We want to make sure your image is sharp. But if not, I would recommend setting up on a tripod, lowering your ISO, and shooting with a longer exposure. Your image is missized. We talked about that. I posted that for you. But so we can't get it much larger and see the detail to see if it has digital noise or not, because it starts to get pixelated. But I would guess in these areas and in this area here, you would start to notice that digital noise. So you want to bring that down. Now, your exposure here is a trickier exposure. It's a dark scene, so you would probably, when your meter is at neutral, you would have to underexpose in order to properly represent it. And you have a good exposure here. Focus looks nice and sharp on the windows, and the light is nice as it's coming down. It's highlighting the edges of each of these leaves. Now, if the light was coming from straight behind her and onto these leaves, if it was like sunset, that might really flatten out the leaves because you'd be illuminating them from the front and we wouldn't see the depth between each one. But because this is lit more from above, we have more texture happening. This image is by Laisha. You're at ISO 400, 50 millimeters, f14 at 1/100th of a second. So those settings all look good. If you wanted to in a situation like this, you don't need much depth of field, so you could open up your aperture more in order to get a little bit of a faster shutter speed. No change needs to be done. There's nothing wrong with this image, but just something for you to consider as you are photographing. The exposure here looks like it's about half a stop underexposed. And we'll look at a lot of these images where they're underexposed and they have a lot of white in them. I'll look at those at the end. But you can see the whites need to be represented as white instead of this gray. As we look at the histogram, you don't have anything on that right side, and that's where these whites should be hitting. You have line here, you have shape, you have pattern, you have all of them in this image, but this was posted as your second image for shape, and we definitely have the shape. You have the shape of all of these boxes and the repetition of the boxes with the small ones on the side. So this was a smart crop on your part. You're nice and square to your subject. We have this line almost perfectly along the side here. That's hard to do. You have to line everything up just perfectly as far as where things are in your frame, as well as having the back of your camera parallel to the surface that you're photographing. So you did a great job framing this up and including just what needs to be there. We have this next image by Gianni. You're at ISO 400, 50 millimeters, f14 at 1/80th of a second. All of those settings look good. And here we have all of these rocks. As they are pushed up maybe against the base of a bird bath, or I don't know what this might be. But what we're really interested in is the shape and the repetition of the shape. So when we're looking at shape, you can have shape like we will in Kim's image, and I'll come back to that, where it really stands out from the background, or here you can emphasize it by having the repetition of the shape. So that's what's happening here. You have some light coming in, and it's illuminating half of the rocks, and then the other half starts to fall into shadow, and that adds more depth and texture to them as well. This image is by Vince for shape, ISO 800, 31 millimeters, f4.2 at 1/4000th of a second. So really fast shutter speed in order to capture the flame. As fire's moving, it's going to move really fast. I think a lot of things move faster than we expect them to. So to have everything nice and sharp here, he had to have a really fast shutter speed. So this was a great capture for you. And we have the shape of the flame, and you've gotten close. So it's not like we're sitting back and looking at a campfire. Like, we're like enamored by this. We're getting as close as we can, and it's overtaking the frame, and we just start to look at all of the lines and shapes that's happening here. So this was another smart image by you. This image is by Irwin. We're at ISO 100, nice and low. 55 millimeters, f8 at 1/5 of a second. So those settings all look good. For this to be a sharp image, you would need to be either very, very rested and still, or probably on a tripod. And we can see that this is a nice sharp image. This is a tricky exposure because we have the light in the background that's all blown out, but that's totally fine. That's going to tell your camera meter that there's more light on the subject than there is. So it would be likely that this image would be underexposed, but you have a great exposure here. So you adjusted in order to have the correct exposure on your subject. The light coming in gives nice shape as we see it reaches around and then comes onto this side. We have some highlights down here, but these would kind of get lost if you didn't have the highlight of the light coming through, right? That's creating that shape and that repetition that we're looking for. So we have the shape of, I'm guessing this is like the axle of a bike, and maybe the brakes of a bike. And we're looking at that shape and the repetition of the shape from the front piece to the back piece. And then this is the last image by Kim, and she really simplified this image by getting close and just having this one yellow leaf here. You're at ISO 400, 98 millimeters, so a pretty long lens. f8 at 1/20th of a second. At 1/20th of a second, you want to make sure you're on a tripod for this image. Now, the exposure, again, here is a tricky exposure because your camera is going to tell you to make this middle gray, and then the blacks are all going to be really washed out. So you'd have to underexpose this image in order to get the correct exposure. And you have that. We see these blacks as black. We can look at your histogram and see that everything's pushed to the left-hand side. So this is a good exposure. You've used the rule of thirds, as we have that leaf just about on a third line there. So that was a nice composition on your part. And you've kept these lines pretty straight here all the way across. So that makes it really even. And then we don't get hung up on those edges. We can just look at the texture of the wood and the leaf standing out there.